He sits in the dim light of his Carmel home, the Pacific wind tapping softly against the window. 95 years behind him, and a silence stretching almost as long, Clint Eastwood has faced outlaws, soldiers, and the ghosts of his own making. But now his voice is lower, his gaze steadier. When he finally speaks of Sondra Locke, it isn't with the swagger of a movie legend. It's with the measured calm of a man reckoning with time. For decades, he said almost nothing. Journalists avoided the subject. Friends didn't bring up her name. When they did, he'd nod politely, change the subject, and move on. But in the twilight of his life, something has shifted. Asked recently about Sondra Locke, the actress who shared his screen, his home, and his heart, Eastwood didn't deflect. "We went through a lot," he said quietly. "It was complicated. Two words simple enough. Yet behind them lies one of Hollywood's most tangled stories of collaboration and control, devotion and division, and two careers forever shadowed by what happened between them. For years, the world saw only the headlines. Now at last, he's speaking in the only way he knows how. Plainly, carefully, without adornment. He doesn't call it regret. He calls it looking back. The difference matters. Regret implies you'd change something. Looking back means you finally dare to face it. To understand what he means, we have to travel backward to the start of two separate lives that collided on a film set in the 1970s and never truly parted in memory. Clint Eastwood was born in San Francisco in 1930, the child of a working-class family chasing stability during the Great Depression. His father moved from job to job. His mother kept the family anchored. Clint grew into a tall, quiet teenager who loved jazz and the outdoors. Acting wasn't on the map. He studied business briefly, worked odd jobs, and even served in the army. When he drifted into Hollywood, it wasn't ambition, it was chance. By the late 1950s, he had caught a lucky break on the TV Western Rawhide. The show ran 8 years and taught him the rhythm of long days and silent discipline. He absorbed the craft of camera placement, timing, and audience psychology. In 1964, he took a gamble that would define his image. Sergio Leone's A Fistful of Dollars. Shot in Spain, dismissed by American studios, the film made him an international star. The man with no name was born, and so was the Eastwood myth. For the next decade, he shaped that persona through the good, the bad, and the ugly. Dirty Harry, High Plains Drifter, the Outlaw Josey Wales. He learned directing on the job, minimal takes, maximum control. He didn't talk about feelings. He showed them through silence and action. That restraint became his armor. Sondra Locke entered the picture from another path entirely. Born Sandra Louise Smith in 1944 in Tennessee, she grew up restless, precocious, and determined to escape small-town limits. After college, she reinvented herself as Sondra Locke, a name that sounded like a promise. At 23, she landed her breakout in The Heart is a Lonely Hunter, 1968, earning an Academy Award nomination. Critics called her performance tender and unsettling. Hollywood, however, never knew what to do with her. Too sharp to be an ingenue, too soft-spoken to be a rebel. By the mid-1970s, she was working steadily, but looking for a project that would stretch her. When she joined the cast of The Outlaw Josey Wales in 1976, directed by and starring Eastwood, she found it and him. On-set stories describe an immediate connection, a quiet respect that deepened into something more. The movie was shot in Arizona and Utah, long days in the sun and dust. Between takes, they talked about art, music, and the absurdity of Hollywood. She later wrote that he made her feel seen, truly seen, in a way few men ever had. To Eastwood, she was smart, quick, unafraid to challenge him. He liked that. For a man used to control, her independence was both thrilling and disarming. Within months, they were inseparable. Their professional chemistry was electric. Josey Wales became a hit, praised for its grit and emotion. Eastwood invited Locke into his next projects, The Gauntlet, 1977, Every Which Way But Loose, 1978, Bronco Billy, 1980, Any Which Way You Can, 1980, and Sudden Impact, 1983. Audiences loved them together. They were a screen couple that felt lived in, imperfect, real. Off-screen, they shared homes in Los Angeles and Carmel. Friends described them as partners, though neither divorced their legal spouses for years. The arrangement seemed stable until it wasn't. In interviews from that era, Eastwood rarely mentioned her. He preferred to keep work and life separate, though the two had long fused. Locke, meanwhile, began directing her own films, including Ratboy and Impulse, eager to prove herself beyond his orbit. She wanted recognition on her own terms. That ambition, once what drew him to her, began to strain the relationship. By 1989, after 13 years together, the silence between them had grown louder than any argument. One April day, Locke returned home to find the locks changed literally. The relationship ended without warning. She filed a palimony suit that same year, claiming she had given up her own career to support his. He countered quietly through lawyers. For the tabloids, it was a spectacle. For the people involved, it was devastation. Eastwood never spoke publicly about it. Locke, 6 years later, broke that silence in her memoir, The Good, the Bad, and the Very Ugly. She described him as brilliant and controlling, generous and punishing, someone she loved deeply and feared losing. The book was both catharsis and confrontation. Critics debated its tone. Eastwood said nothing. The man who had built his image on silence stayed consistent. Yet time has a way of loosening even the tightest grip. As Eastwood aged, directing films like Unforgiven, $1 Million, Baby, Mystic River, and Gran Torino, themes of reckoning crept into his art. Guilt, redemption, aging, legacy, they became his language. When asked in later interviews about mistakes, he'd pause longer before answering. "You can't go back," he once said. "You just try to understand." Locke's later years were quieter. She survived breast cancer in the early 1990s, directed a handful of films, and lived largely out of public view. When she died in 2018 at 74, Eastwood released no statement, no tribute. Friends say he was informed privately and mourned in his own way. Publicly, silence once again filled the space between them, but silence is never the same thing as indifference. In 2023, while reflecting on his life for a documentary project, Eastwood mentioned her name without prompting. "Sondra was talented," he said. "She could have done more." The sentence hung there, simple, unsentimental, but heavy. For those who knew the story, it was as close to an acknowledgement as they'd ever heard. When asked if he regretted how things ended, he paused. "I don't know," he replied. "You make choices, and sometimes you don't see how they hit other people. You think you're doing what's right for you, and maybe you're not." It's not an apology, but it's not avoidance either. For a man who once played characters that solved every problem with a gun or a glare, this honesty without armor feels like growth. At 95, Clint Eastwood no longer needs to defend his legend. His legacy is secure. What he seems to be doing now is humanizing it. The great irony of his life is that he's spent decades playing men who could never look back. Now he finally is. He admits that his relationship with Locke was volatile, but insists it wasn't cruel. "We were two strong people," he told a longtime friend. Sometimes strong people don't mix for long. Yet beneath that toughness lies a gentler truth, one that his closest collaborators have noticed. Since Locke's passing, Eastwood has become more reflective, less guarded. His later interviews often circle back to the idea of unfinished conversations. Perhaps that's what this is, a man having a conversation too late, but having it nonetheless. Even now at 95, he works. He still drives himself to the studio, still tinkers with scripts, still directs from a chair beside the camera. But when talk turns to the past, he speaks slower. "You can't change what you did," he says, "but you can tell it straight." And telling it straight is what he's finally begun to do. The older Clint Eastwood moves more slowly now. Age has thinned his voice but sharpened his clarity. Sitting in his editing room wooden desk, coffee gone cold, he looks at reels of film stacked in silence. To visitors, it feels like standing in a shrine to choices. On the wall hang stills from Unforgiven and the Bridges of Madison County, faces frozen mid-emotion. Each reel is a life examined, each cut a decision made. When the conversation turns to Sondra Locke, he does not flinch anymore. "She was good," he says, "better than most people knew." Those who have known Eastwood for decades say this small admission carries the weight of a confession. The man who never looked back now does, with restraint that still surprises his friends. He does not rewrite history, he simply acknowledges it. For a generation that only remembers the lawsuit headlines, that matters. He remembers how fiercely Locke fought to direct, how Hollywood at the time dismissed women behind the camera. When she directed Rat Boy in 1986, critics sneered, distributors hesitated. Yet she persisted. Eastwood privately financed part of it, but later admitted he didn't support her as much as he could have. "I was too focused on my own stuff," he said in a 2022 profile. "I should have let her run with it." It's not an apology dressed as poetry. It's the plain language of an old craftsman. Still, for Eastwood, plain words often mean more than flowery remorse. Locke's own account from her memoir remains painful, reading her sense of invisibility, of being sidelined by the man she loved. Eastwood never contested most of her narrative publicly, and today he concedes that she had her version, I had mine, and somewhere in there is the truth. It's the most balanced statement he's ever given on the matter. The younger man might have fought for control, the elder one yields to perspective. Friends say that after Locke's death, Eastwood screened the Outlaw Josey Wales alone one evening. When the closing credits rolled, he didn't move for minutes. It was their first film together, their beginning. In it, he plays a man haunted by loss, wandering toward redemption. Perhaps that is why he cannot entirely escape it. "We were both stubborn," he murmured later. "That's what worked on screen and failed off it." As he revisits those memories, he recognizes how the industry around them magnified everything. The 1970s studio system loved a power couple, but offered little protection for the woman inside it. Locke's career became a footnote to his, her talent eclipsed by gossip columns. Decades later, critics began re-evaluating her work not as Eastwood's partner, but as one of the few women directors to challenge masculine archetypes from inside the machine. That reassessment has softened Eastwood's tone. "She earned her place," he said simply. He often talks about legacy now, not just films, but fairness. In conversations with younger directors, he mentions Locke by name as someone who knew how to look at a story sideways. To those who grew up idolizing him, the comment lands like a revelation. The taciturn cowboy citing a forgotten collaborator? It feels like closure. And yet, there's an ache that lingers in every recollection. Because for all his success, 4 Oscars, a half-century of cultural dominance, Eastwood knows that fame never erases what silence leaves behind. "You can win an award," he said, "but you can't outshoot time." When he describes those years now, he does so with both pride and fatigue. "We were good together," he admits, "until we weren't." Then a pause. You don't notice when something's ending. You just keep moving, thinking the next picture will fix it. The next pictures did not fix it. They became metaphors for it instead. Unforgiven, 1992, was about guilt. Million Dollar Baby, 2004, about devotion and loss. Gran Torino, 2008, about a man learning to listen. Whether consciously or not, Eastwood has spent the last 3 decades turning private reckoning into public art. In doing so, he's given audiences the apology he never verbalized. Each film whispers what he cannot say aloud. That strength means nothing without compassion, that solitude is not peace, and that love mishandled becomes legacy's ghost. As Eastwood approaches a century of life, his world has grown smaller, simpler. He spends mornings composing at the piano, afternoons editing. Reporters note that when questions touch on Locke now, his eyes brighten, a sign not of pain, but of memory. "She had timing," he says once, smiling faintly. "She knew when to look at the camera and when not to." It's an observation only a director or a lover would make. He has never claimed sainthood. In interviews, he laughs at the myth of moral heroes. "Movies make you look braver than you are," he told a friend. "Real life's messier." In acknowledging that, he invites viewers to see him not as the invincible gunslinger, but as a man shaped by contradictions. The audience that grew up on his films can finally meet the human behind them. The question people ask now is whether Eastwood feels absolved. He doesn't use that word. Instead, he says, "I understand it better." Understanding at his age is its own kind of peace. The battles are over, only interpretation remains. In that quiet understanding lies an unexpected tenderness. When friends mention Locke's name, he no longer tenses. He speaks of her directing ambitions with respect, of her tenacity with something close to admiration. "She fought the system," he says. "That's never easy." Coming from a man who once defined himself by outsmarting systems, it's high praise. There's also gratitude subtle, understated, but unmistakable. If not for her, he once reflected, I might not have looked at the world differently. That single line reframes their story. Not predator and victim, not myth and casualty, but two flawed artists whose collision forced growth. In the end, Sondra Locke's influence survives not only in her own films, but in the moral texture of his later ones. The empathy that surfaces in Letters from Iwo Jima, the humility of Richard Jewell, the quiet dignity of Cry Macho, these are notes absent from his early work. Time and reflection carved them in. So when he finally speaks up about her, it isn't for spectacle or confession. It's an act of restoration. He gives her name back to history without defense or denial. He allows the record to breathe. The camera pans out on the old director one last time. Outside, the sea air rattles the blinds. Gulls call over the cliffs. Eastwood closes his eyes, maybe remembering a younger man on a desert set, a woman laughing beside him, the heat of Arizona light. Then he opens them again and says softly, you keep learning. No more, no less. That's the line that stays. It isn't dramatic, it's human. Because at 95, Clint Eastwood doesn't need forgiveness. He's done something rarer. He's faced his own myth and chosen to speak not to justify, but to understand. And perhaps that's the truth he's been circling all along.